believe how well we're sticking to time here. This is fantastic. Could we move on to our next speaker, who is Mary Craig? Is Mary there? Would you like to come on screen? There she is. Excellent. So I'm going to pass it over to Mary, who is going to talk about the Brothers. Is that right? I've got it right.
That's right, yep.
Excellent, thank you. I just wanted to hear you speak before I switch my thing off. That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Over to you, Mary.
Good afternoon, everybody. And again, I have to make an apology in advance because we've got really high winds here in the Borders at the moment, and my electricity and my internet is playing silly beggars on me. So if I disappear, it's not because I've gone in the huff. Hopefully it won't happen. Hopefully it'll only happen for seconds, but let's, fingers crossed. Yes, I wanted to talk today about the Witch Brothers, and I was really interested in what Julian was talking about earlier, about the fact that we'll often say, you know, oh yes, my great-great-granny was a witch or something like this, but none of us ever want to say that my great-great-granddad was a witch brother. And I think it's very interesting that we have these different characters within the witch trial situations. So I'm based down in the Borders, where there were quite a high number of witch trials, I think higher than the population, you know, given the population, I thought it was higher than normal. You know, not big numbers like Edinburgh, Lothians and Fife, but still pretty high numbers. And we did have several of the Witch Brothers come down quite frequently into the Borders. And I sort of wanted to have a think about that, because within the 17th century, you've got the Kirk and the Kirk ministers and everything completely obsessed with the devil. You've got ordinary folk terrified by the thought of the devil. You've got accused women and men utterly bewildered and terrified and everything by what's happening to them, and the thought that somehow they're in snare of the devil. And in most of these cases, we can sort of get an inkling into their way of thinking. We might not agree with it, but we can sort of understand why they believed what they believed. But the Witch Brothers, I always think they're like a step too far. You know, they're so far from our experience that we just think, no, I'm not sure about this. You know, that, and in some ways, I don't think that's helpful, because it becomes very easy to sort of consign them to being the bogeyman. That's the monster. And then you can sort of dump all the blame on the monster. And that's nicely dusted, and you can sort of put a bow on top of that. So is that where we're putting the Brothers? Are we safe to just consign them into the monster box and just leave them there? So that's sort of what I wanted to explore today. So as I said, the Borders had a strange pattern of witch trials. They had the witch panics like everybody had, and they had other trials in between times, and they had a lot of accusations that often didn't make it to trial. You know, the similar patterns to other places in Scotland, but there seemed to be a sort of little bit of a difference in the Borders. And I think it was because they developed almost a slightly different mindset. And I mean the Borders Kirk and folk in the Borders. And the problem is that, like, we know the 17th century, Queen Elizabeth dies and James takes himself and his senior court down to London, because that's where the money's to be made. The other nobles, and especially the nobles in the Borders, so the Duke of Buccleuch and the Duke of Roxburgh, they tend to go up to Edinburgh to make their power base up there. And they leave a wee bit of a power vacuum. And the only people you have to step into that power vacuum is the Kirk. Obviously, up in the Highlands, you would still have a bit of the clan structure, but the big border families, they had gone, the big border raving families, they had gone in previous centuries. So the only person who's the authority is the minister. And that's fine, that's absolutely fine, because they are the authority, they'll keep you on the straight and narrow, and you know, they're always there. It's the minister who baptizes you, the minister marries you, the minister buries you. And that's great. And these are the ones that you would go to if you had a problem. These are the ones that would give you a bit of help if they could. I'm really conscious that you're really just seeing my head. I don't know what's up with my camera today, so apologies for that. But yeah, so the Kirk is your main authority. And then around your Kirk, you've got your Kirk elders who are supporting the Kirk minister, and you've got your Kirk session. And they're a sort of little mini court, if you like, that keep an eye on you, make sure you're behaving yourself. because the 17th century is a century of sin. The place is awash with sin. The devil is out to get you, and he's using his handmaidens, witches, predominantly women, but some men, to get you. So the Kirk sessions that keeps an eye on you, it's telling you really how to behave and how you should be dressed and how you should speak and how you should act and more or less how you should think. And this isn't because they just decided to do that of a day. They as Julian was saying, they genuinely thought the devil was out there. And so they were in their way trying to protect you. And especially in the borders, there's a real problem because everything that's happening around you is proving to you that the devil is out there. The century down in the borders, depending where you are, obviously, starts off with a couple of harvest failures. And there are a couple of localized outbreaks of plague. Now, we don't know if it was bubonic plague or if it was cholera, but it didn't really matter. It killed you, you know. So you've got famine and you've got plague. And then across the continent, you get the 30 Years' War kicking off. And you've got Protestants and Catholics fighting each other. Now, the borders is very well connected to the continent, simply because the Borders Abbey, for years with the wool trade, have been trading with Flemish traders. And so there's a lot of contact with the borders. There's a lot of contact across in the Low Countries. And so you get travellers' tales, which always grow in the telling, of course. So there's all these travellers coming over and telling you about all of these Catholic atrocities. And the Catholics are, as we all know, in league with the devil. So you've got famine and you've got pestilence, and now you've got a bit of war over there. And then the Catholics in Ireland, they're kicking off as well, and some of them are coming across to Argyllshire. So in a way, it sort of starts to feel a little bit like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, if you like. You know, it's really getting that way. And especially in the borders, because just over the border into England, you've got the big families over there. Some of the families over there have stayed Catholic. And a lot of the ones that weren't Catholic, they were Protestant, but they weren't really Calvinist Protestant. They were Anglican and well, we're not quite sure about those. So the borders, if you like, develops this siege mentality where they start to think that they are surrounded. And of course, they're Calvinist, they're God's elect. And we know that we're saved. We're preordained to be saved because we're Calvinist. And there's all these Catholics around us, and there's all this fighting going on, and the devil's doing all sorts of things. Well, who's the devil going to attack but his own? He's not going to attack a guy whose soul he already has. So the more godly you are, the more chances the devil's going to attack you. And the more the devil attacks you, well, the more that proves you're godly. So it sort of becomes this sort of circle that goes round and round and round, which is where the Kirk becomes obsessed with the devil. And you can understand why, because everything around him is reinforcing that belief. And then, of course, they start to tell people that. Every Sunday, the sermon tells you, watch out for the devil, watch out for witches. The Kirk elders will tell you about witches. The Kirk sessions watching your behaviour to see if you're going to be witches. So you've got all of that going on. And then, of course, James dies and his son, Charles, takes over in England. And Charles decides he wants a uniform faith. I mean, we know all this. So he decides he wants a uniform faith, but he's not going to go down the Calvinist Scottish route. He wants episcopacy. So now the Kirk is at odds with the king. Well, that's not what you should be doing. You shouldn't be in conflict with the king. But that's true. And this is all in the first half of the century. And then, as if it's not just bad enough, we chop the king's head off. I mean, this is a world turned upside down. Now, your king may be mad, your king may be bad, your king may be mad and bad, but he's still your king. But we've chopped his head off. So you've got all of this background fear and chaos and anxiety going on. And the Borders Kirk, especially seeing themselves surrounded, have this obsession with the devil. We might not quite agree with them, but we can sort of understand where if you're putting people under that amount of pressure, then they're going to find a reason for it. They're going to find an outlet for that stress. They're going to find somebody to blame. And so all of that's going on all the time. The more witches are coming, and every time you think, oh, the witches have gone away, another one appears in another village, or another one appears in the town next to you, all of the time. And if you're a good Christian, and the harvest fails, or if you're a good Christian and your child falls ill or your hens stop laying, what other explanation can there be? Because as Julian said, everybody was a Christian at this point. Now, there were a few Jews about in Scotland at that time, but they were absolutely keeping their heads down. But everybody's a Christian. You might well believe in magic, and you might think that maybe the little people might help you find something lost if you speak to them nicely. But the fact that you're Christian is absolute. Your belief in God is absolute. Your belief that the devil exists is absolute. So if everything is telling you that this is happening, if all of this background chaos is happening all the time, then there is only one place to go, and that is the kirk, and the kirk will tell you, yes, it is witches. Yes, it is the devil. Yes, you need to be terrified. You need to be aware of this sin, that you do not get caught up in this. I'm sorry, my computer is really playing up me today, folks. I'm losing images. Right, so this fear, this tension, this anxiety keeps growing and keeps growing and keeps growing until there is nothing you can do but cry witch. And if it was just one witch, you could maybe cope with that. Or if it was maybe just two witches, you could cope with that. But it's not, it's several witches. And that's when you pull in your witch brothers. That's when you get the experts in to help you, to save you from the devil. Now, we know that the devil's mark was sort of one of the four main proofs within the witchcraft trials. We know that. And I always find it interesting, the devil's mark, because when I first started studying this, so it's years ago now, I was really sort of, where on earth did this come from? And then, of course, I realised it actually comes from quite a long tradition of understanding that people's clothing or their bodies themselves would be marked. And that would be a sign of status or a sign of who you were or what you were. So, for example, the Jews I was talking about, they would wear stars on their clothing. Crusaders would wear crosses. And people would notice blemishes on your skin, or travelling doctors might tattoo a snake on their arm so you knew who they were. There are some traditions that say God himself was tattooed. So it comes from a long tradition. And, if I see you and you've got lots of boils, you've got really bad skin, I know that you've been a sinful person. That's an outward sign of your sin. So by the time you come into the 17th century and talking about your face or your neck or your shoulders being marked, that's coming from that tradition. But there's a difference. So if I'm in the 13th or 14th century and I see the woman down the road covered in boils, I know she's a sinful woman. And I know that that is her punishment from God. She's been punished. That's the boils. And I'm getting a warning from God. And I'm a good Christian and I can read that. Simple. But by the 17th century, it's not God that's marking these dreadful women. It's the devil. And I'm a good Christian, so I don't know how to interpret that. And that's where you need the expert. That's where you need to bring in your brothers who can interpret those signs. I mean, you have to bring in an expert. It's not even just your local minister sometimes can't tell, but you have to bring that mark in. You have to bring this expert in. And that's where it's fascinating. Now, we all know that, I mean, Julian's spoken about it as well, the fact that there are a lot of records out there. Some of them are really full for some people's trials, some not so much. Sometimes it's just a line in a Kirk session record, or sometimes it's just a throwaway remark. And so it's difficult sometimes to either get overwhelmed by the numbers and then frustrated because you can't find out all the facts. But the questions that have always gone through my mind were, why did the brothers do what they did? Why were they allowed to do it? What made them experts, and why, as we know, so many of them were exposed as frauds? Did they continue to be called in by parishes? Well, what's going on there? As I say at the beginning, are they just the monsters we can put in the monster box and forget about? So I wanted to sort of have a look at that, because all of these things are difficult, and they're is why were parishes using them? Why were people calling them in? Why were Kirk ministers thinking, I don't know if Bessie at the end of the road's a witch, I need a witch brother? Why would you do that? Why would you want to do that? You get a lot of witch brothers coming into the borders. They were travelling all over Scotland, and some of the witch brothers went down into England, some of the Scottish witch brothers. But what's interesting was that for all the numbers of the accusations and all the numbers of those who were brought to trial, there were only about 10, maybe 10, 12 Broders that we actually know that much about. And that to me is interesting, that there were only these 10. And they were mostly sort of between about 1648 and 1662 was when they were most active. And there were a lot of witch accusations at that point. There were a lot of people went to trial and a lot of people executed. And I think those two, it's not definitive, obviously. In any form of history, you have to be careful how you put 2 and 2 together and not make 5. But this period where you have the most brooding activity is when you tend to get high numbers of executions, high numbers of trials and executions. And remember, these Broders were for the most part licensed by the Privy Council. You know, they weren't just, it wasn't just Jimmy at the end of the road that decided he was going to start going and sticking pins in people. It may have started like that, but these people were licensed. They were known to the Privy Council as to what they were doing, you know. And it was a big thing. Now, Julian talked earlier about the fact that, you know, burning a witch was actually a really expensive thing to do. And the witch Broders are one of the few people that made a bit of money. So the witch Broder might turn up in your village. He's on his horse. He's got his servant. They might even be on a horse as well. So they're going to need food. They're going to need accommodation. They're going to need stabling for their horse. They're going to need all of those expenses, in addition to the fee they get paid for any witches they find. So it wasn't, you know, it was not a small undertaking for you to call a witch in, especially if you're in a small, if you're in a small community, or if you're in a small village. It's a lot of money for you to shell out. And of course, you start thinking then, well, if these are the ones that are making money, are they in it because that's why they're doing it? Is it because they can make money? You know, and the 17th century is one of those where people are doing God's work, if you like. Brooding is God's work. It's what you want to do. But if you're part of God's elect, if you're one of God's elect and you genuinely believe the devil is out there, then you've got choices. Are you going to become a minister and preach against the devil? Or maybe you don't have the learning for that. Or maybe you could be a kirk elder. You need to have a really good standing in your community to do that. Or maybe you think God's calling on you to do a more active role, to physically find witches. And so a lot of the witch Broders, you think, are starting out with that mindset. They're doing God's work. They genuinely believe in what they're doing. So you set off to do that. But unfortunately, because of the money aspect, as in all aspects of human life, the minute you bring money into it, then the charlatans, then the frauds, then people like that appear. So if we start off with an example of, say, John Balfour. Now, John Balfour, wait till I check my note, 1632, that's right. John Balfour was one of the earlier Broders, and he seemed to be brooding people perfectly well. He was going about his business, and he was brooding, you know, locally. But then he gets called in front, in 1632, he gets called in front of the Privy Council because it said he was brooding people for his personal gain. And so they're looking at him and they're saying, well, what's your expertise? Why are you doing this? Are you allowed to do this? How have you got the right to do this? How do you know what you're doing? And it's obvious that all he's doing is lying in his pocket, which is fine, except for the fact that he'd been brooding people for ages when the Privy Council bring him in. So he had been brooding people. He had had that level of authority. He had been brought in by local magistrates. He'd been brought in by kirk ministers. So he should have had a warrant. And if he had a warrant, that surely would only be given to him if he had that level of expertise. And yet here we are in 1632, and he's been brought in to ask what his expertise is. So it's very odd. We're not exactly sure what happened. Did he start off having a warrant and then he lost it? Or did he never have it, but he'd been conning people and said he had? It's a little bit unsure as to what was going on. But he most certainly got dragged in front of the Privy Council about all of this. But what's interesting is what was angering the Privy Council the most was the fact that he was sort of cheating people and getting a bit of money out of it. But it was the fact that he was brooding without the proper warrant, the proper paperwork. That was what really made them quite angry, which is a point we're going to come back to 2 and 3 times. Another example is George Casey. Now, George Casey starts off, we first find him in Lanarkshire. He's about 1650, in the 1650s, and he's brooding people. And again, he's brooding quite reputably. He's got the right licenses. He's brooding. He's been brought in by Kirk ministers and local communities, and he's doing fine. And then he pitches up way across in Haddington in East Lothian. And he pitches up, he's brought in, we find about an accused witch called Janet Coates. Janet Coates is arrested by the Presbytery in Haddington, brought in, questioned, and she names 2 or 3 other women. She says, oh, that one's a witch, and that one's a witch, and that one's a witch. Trouble is, Janet isn't from Haddington. She's originally from Peebles. And so she doesn't know who she's naming. And she names 2 or 3 women that are locally known to the minister as very pious women. So she's in trouble here. She's named the wrong folk. So they're absolutely furious with her, yelling at her, how dare you name pious women and all the rest of it. And suddenly she confesses that what she's doing is she is in league with George Casey. And the 2 of them have got this scheme going whereby she pitches up in a town, names half a dozen women, he's brought in, he finds the devil's mark, he gets paid, and then he helps her escape or gets a lesser sentence. So the Presbytery in Haddington aren't quite sure what to do about this. They bring in George Casey, and of course he does what anybody would do and absolutely denounces her as a lying witch. He does the, oh, how dare you, I'm a witch brother, and that lying witch is telling you this, and you don't believe in her, and da-da. Doesn't it quite work? The Haddington Presbytery are not convinced by John Casey. Neither are they quite convinced about Janet Coates either, because she gets executed, poor Janet. But they send up to the Privy Council to say that George Casey needs to get arrested and he needs to be investigated. But I'm not quite sure. I haven't actually traced down all of the records as to what happens with George, but he seems to have sort of disappeared. I don't know, as I say, if he gets arrested or not. But again, it's the fact that he's sort of bringing the Privy Council into disrepute that they're really not happy with. You get lots of these. There's also the case, a very curious case of John Dixon, who again, it's in the late 1650s, and we find note of him away up in Elgin. And in the early 1660s, the Elgin Presbytery actually say, we'll take you on for a year. And we'll pay your expenses, and we'll pay you for witches, and we'll pay you for this, and we'll pay you for that. That's fine, except that George Dixon turns out to be a woman. At which point the Privy Council probably lost their minds about that, because women can't be in charge of men. Women cannot be experts. Remember that the witch brothers were experts that the Kirk minister looked up to. You cannot have the Kirk minister looking up to a woman. And again, there needs to be more research into what happened to these women. Why was she impersonating a witch brother? Did she think it was her way of making money? Was it her way of hiding herself from possible being found out to be a witch? I don't quite know. So we need a lot more information about these sorts of things. We really need to be exploring the witch brothers and finding out what they were up to. So these are people that, we can sort of put them under the label of con men, if you like, or under the label of just fraudsters, which is fine. Until you look at someone like John Dick, not John Dixon. I know the names are nicely confusing. But John Dick, again, late 1650s, just double check my dates. I'm terrible on dates, folks, my apologies. But yes, he's late 1650s again. And he's brooding quite well. He's brooding in front of ministers. He's brooding in front of Kirk elders. Everything's fine. He's got his correct warrants. And then a complaint's lodged against him. And the complaint is that he's going about the country and he is brooding people, he's brooding innocent people. And there's one chap in particular called John Hay, that apparently he's brooding him so much that it's classed as torture. And I'm using torture specifically, and we know that torture in the 17th century is not the same as we would consider torture today. We know that, and as Julie was saying earlier, most of the time it's watching the witches and keeping them awake and walking them and watching them all the time, and sleep deprivation is horrific. But with this chap, they've actually used, the Privy Council itself uses the word torture in what it's saying. And it turns out that he is absolutely just a sadist. And I'm not pretending to be a psychologist, but we know the devil tended to mark people in Scotland on their head, their face, their neck, their shoulders. John Dick would strip people completely naked. He would have them completely naked and shaved. He would broad them in their privy parts and their genitalia. This was a man that enjoyed what he was doing. Now, maybe he doesn't hit the clinical definition of sadist, but I think for the purposes of me and my history degree, I'm going for the word sadist on this one. Yes, he made money, but it seems more that it was the pleasure of it. It was that he was enjoying doing it more than anything else that seemed to drive John Dick. And so this is another one where the Privy Council are going, oh no, this is not good enough. This is absolutely not good enough. Again, somebody that's bringing the Privy Council into disrepute because of the fact that, people are looking and saying, well, did he have the right warrant from the Privy Council? What's he been up to? And then we have, of course, the one witch brother that most people have heard of is John Kincaid. Now, John Kincaid is possibly originally from Stirlingshire, and possibly originally from a somewhat shady family in Stirlingshire. They seem to have been up to all sorts of criminality. And John moves to Trinent, maybe to dissociate himself from his family, who knows, but anyway, he pitches up in Trinent. And he's sort of working again, sort of 1649 up to about 1662 is his period. And the first note we have of him is in 1669 when he's brought out to Dirleton Castle, 1649. And he's already, from the way the records are written, he's already an established brother. He already knows what he's doing. He's brought out by two people, Patrick Watson and his wife, Minnie Halliburton. And they actually are continually saying that they're innocent, and they want John Kincaid to brood them to prove they're innocent. A brave act. And John Kincaid comes out, and unfortunately he finds the devil's mark on both of them, on the left side of their neck, on their shoulder, unfortunately. And that's it. They are then executed. And the next time, I think actually in that same year, we find a note of John Kincaid down in Newcastle. So he's brooding all over the place. We see notes of him up in Aberdeenshire. He's across in the west of Scotland. He's mostly in the Lothians, a little bit of Fife, a little bit in the borders. At one point in 1661, the communities in Forfar actually give him sort of like the freedom of the borough because of the number of witches that he had found, which sounds great up to a point. And then in 1662, it all comes crashing down. The Privy Council get this recommendation, something's going on, or they get this, note from somebody saying, John Kincaid, no, he's at it now. And they have to drag him in, and they chuck him in the Edinburgh Tolbooth, and they investigate what's going on. And here we go again. He's been brooding without the right licence. And this is interesting because John Kincaid had always pitched up, he always had his right licence, he was supposed to be there, he'd been called in, it was all official, and yet here he is now, brooding without a licence. So why that change from early on to later on, I don't know. I don't know what happened there with John. I don't know if there was, did he succumb to just like making as much money as he could? From the witch brooding, I don't know. My apologies, my computer is really playing up on me now, and I know that you're not seeing me. I'm hoping that's a bit better. We're not quite sure with John what was going on there, but all of a sudden he turns up and he ends up in prison. And then the more they discover, it's not just that he doesn't have the correct paperwork, it's that he's been brooding innocent people. And so there are real problems coming in with John there. And he's in prison, I mean, he's getting on a bit. He's an older man, he's a little bit infirm now, and they keep him in prison for a couple of months, and they actually start to get worried he might die in prison. And so John posts bail of £1,000 Scots, which is a lot of money at that point. And he gives this assurance that he will never brood without the proper warrant ever again. And I find that really curious. He doesn't say, I'm not going to brood. He doesn't say, I won't be a brooder anymore. He says, I won't do it without the proper licence. And they have a think about that, and they go, well, it's John, we like him, he's a good guy. And they let him go, and they said, oh, it's okay, we've got £1,000, he's not going to do it without the warrant anymore. And so that's really interesting that they just sort of, maybe are they, I don't know, are they embarrassed by the fact that he's their guy and they've got him in prison now? Are they really worried he's going to die in prison? I don't quite know what's going on there. But what is interesting is that nothing happens, or nothing that I've found really happens about the people that had said, John Kincaid prodded me and I was innocent. And, you know, can I have an appeal or something like that? As far as I'm aware, nothing like that happened. Excuse me, I'm really sorry about this. I'm going to try changing position here and see if I can get this to behave itself slightly more. That might work. Okay. Don't you just love technology? If everybody could just hold on 2 seconds with me, I'm going to try and do something so you can see.
It's actually working fine.
Must just be me. I can't see what I'm doing. Right. Apologies, talking with yourselves. Right. So, as I say, yeah, it's the fact that he's not working with this warrant. Why did he change? Did he become like the George Caseys? Did he suddenly decide all he wanted to do was make money all the time? Did he become the sadist, like John Dick, when he was just brooding people and brooding people and brooding people? I'm not so sure. I think if we delve a bit deeper into John, we might be able to get a bit more of an understanding. Because remember, as we said, he thought he was God's elect. He really genuinely believed that he was God's elect. Everybody knows he's God's elect. Everybody knows that the devil's out there to get you. Everybody knows there's witches. And if you genuinely want to do something, he's going to be a minister. Well, he can't be a minister, John, because he's actually illiterate. And when he starts out around about 1649, when he starts out brooding, he's illiterate. So he hasn't got the training and he hasn't got the money to get himself through a divinity course at the university to become a minister. He can't really be a Kirk elder, because to be a Kirk elder, you have to be really well thought of in your community. And with his family's background, I mean, his family's background includes robbers, thieves, and potentially rapists. There's no way he's going to be doing that. But maybe he genuinely believes that he can find witches and God's calling on him to do this purpose. So you start off with, maybe you're in your local neighbourhood and you say, oh, well, yeah, that Mary, she's a witch. And then I confess to being a witch. And you go, oh, I can't find them. Or maybe you then say, oh, so-and-so else is a witch. And they confess to being a witch. And you think, oh, yeah, right, okay. And then the minister says, oh, you're quite good at this. Could you come in and have a look? And before you know where you are, you're starting to get a reputation. You're starting to get a status. Because remember, witch brothers were the experts that ministers looked up to. Ministers who were the authority of the land looked up to these guys. And if you're someone of John Kincaid's background, you're an illiterate person from a dodgy family, all of a sudden the local minister thinks you're great. All of a sudden the local minister is recommending you to other people. And then you get a warrant from the Privy Council. The secular authority in the land is now saying, yeah, this is the guy to get in. If you've got a problem in your area, bring in that John Kincaid. He's the guy to find your witches. And of course, the more you do, the more your reputation grows. And then the more your reputation grows, the more you're called in, the more witches you find, and it goes round and round and round. Which is great initially. That sounds like great, and you're doing God's work, and everything you're doing is proving to yourself in the righteousness of your cause. But the problem is that what starts off as God's work can very quickly become a horror show. Because if you're called into brood the first person and you're looking carefully for the mark and you're deciding where you're going to brood, you might brood that person 2 or 3 times very carefully to find the devil's mark. And you find it. That's great. And the next week they bring you in to brood 2 witches and you do the same thing again. And then it's 10 witches and then it's 20 witches. How are you going to feel when it's the 50th witch or the 100th witch or the 150th witch that you are brought in to brood? How careful are you going to be? If you genuinely get into that mindset, you know that you're doing God's work, your cause is righteous, and you can go from a religious belief into the frenzy of religious mania if the circumstances are right, and the circumstances in the 17th century are right, everything around you is telling you that the devil's out there. There is war, there is plague, there's pestilence, we're chopping the king's head off, there's witches popping up all the way from Aberdeen all the way down to all the way down to the borders. There's witches in Glasgow, there's witches in Orkney, there's witches all over the place. Maybe not so much in the Highlands, but they're everywhere. And the more you find, the more they appear, and the more they appear, the more you find. And so I think that John Kincaid didn't, I mean, I don't think he was a con man, and I don't think he was a sadist. But I think simply because he was so good at what he did, and because people thought he was as good as what he did, he ends up becoming this man who is committing sadistic acts, if you like, not from a perspective of enjoying what he's doing. I don't think he enjoyed what he did. Maybe he did, but I would doubt it. But because he believed that what he was doing was right, he was consigning the devil's own to where they needed to go. And that's a dangerous, dangerous slippery slope. But let's park John for a minute and then think about the people that called him in, and think about the Privy Council, because if you think about it, John Balfour, our first dodgy guy, was in 1632, and yet the Privy Council are still handing out warrants to Broad's people. We've had John Dixon, we've had all these people being, George Casey, all these frauds exposed, but the Privy Council still believe in Broading. They reckon that there are too many people setting themselves up as experts, and there are too many people claiming to have warrants that don't. And so what's bothering them is the authority of the Privy Council. But Broading itself is the way to find the devil's mark. Now, because of the number of frauds that are exposed, there are fewer numbers. After about 1662, Broading starts to fall away, although I have heard of a Broading case, there's a note of a Broading case in the Borders as late as about 1684, I think, and there is actually one elsewhere, I'm not quite sure where, in about 1718 or something like this. But the Privy Council were stuck because Kirk ministers and communities wanted Broaders being brought in. And this is key. Remember I was saying right at the beginning, you have the Kirk who are obsessed with the devil. You have communities who are terrified of the devil. You have accused women and men who think they've fallen snare to the devil. If you have all of that, that's where your accusation is going to come from, because John Kincaid isn't making the accusations. John Kincaid is brought in when an accusation is made, because it's the century of sin, it's the century of the devil. Everything is telling you that, and they're brought in. And that's why the Privy Council, although they don't like all these fraudsters and all these people prodding without a warrant and calling them into disrepute, they do realise that local communities really want the witch brother to come in. And that's what's important. It's a truism that brutality brutalises those that do it. The John Kincaid, the John Dixons, the George Caseys, we absolutely don't like them. Are they really monsters, or are they just a monstrous part of what was, albeit a monstrous century? Because if we have them, if we just label them as monsters, that's easy for us. That's easy for us to go, they're monsters, put them in a monster box. But no, they came in after an accusation was made. No, nobody was a winner in the 17th century. The Kirk ministers, the Kirk elders were terrified of the devil. Local communities were terrified of the devil. There were women and men who were treated in the most horrific manner and died. There were communities and families left behind devastated, and there were witch brothers who, no matter how much they thought they were doing God's work, must have been affected by what they were doing. We have to see it for what it was, that yes, there were fraudsters making money, yes, there were sadists hiding in plain sight. But picking up John again, I genuinely think he was someone that thought he was righteous. He thought there was that his cause was just. And if you genuinely think that the devil is going to snatch your soul, of course you're going to broad someone if you think you can consign that person to damnation, if you can get rid of that person, if you can get that person out of your community. There were, as I say, only about 10 witch brothers in the whole of Scotland. But there were hundreds, literally hundreds of parishes that asked for them. And whether you were brooded by somebody who was a fraud, like George Casey, who wanted money, or John Dick, who was a sadist, or John Kincaid, who was righteous, I don't think that matters to the person who was being brooded. And maybe whether or not the witch brooders themselves were, charlatans or sadists or righteous, maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question is not about the witch brooders, but about the communities and about the kirk and about the mindset that allowed those witch brothers to operate, because they were not self-proclaimed experts. They were people that people looked at and went, yeah, John will find a witch for you. We created them. We created the monsters in the 17th century. Ordinary people created the monsters of the witch brothers. And then when the craze was over and the century calmed down and the politics calmed down and the religion calmed down, then we didn't need them anymore. And we safely put the monsters away. Like the Frankenstein myth, like the Golem myth, if you create a monster, then you're responsible. The monster can run amok, but you created the monster in the first place. So it's something that I think we should really, really think about. I think we need more investigation into the witch brothers, how they were able to operate and why communities looked to them. Why were they so scared and so anxious that they wanted the monster to come in and save them from what was the worst monster, the devil and his handmaidens, witches. But I think we need to find out more about the witch brothers for two reasons. One is because it gives us a greater understanding of the 17th century, a more nuanced understanding of what was happening, but also to challenge witch finders today. I don't know if any of you are aware of a gentleman called R.A.W.S. And R.A.W.S. is a Nigerian gentleman who spends a lot of time in Africa, and there are other places where people are still accused of being witches today. Predominantly children, but not always, sometimes women. Not all of them are executed, but they are treated abysmally. And almost all of the witch hunters that operate in these countries, places like Nigeria and Senegal, and places like Indonesia, places like Guatemala, they still claim that they are righteous and they are still claiming that they are doing God's work. So what we need to be looking at is what we can learn from the 17th century. And I know that things are not directly comparable, but if we can learn more about the witch brothers that we had in Scotland in the 17th century, then we can say, look, this is what happened when we created these monsters. Do not go down that same path. Do not go down the same path that we did of creating a monster that then runs amok, because you will live to regret it. And so your organisation, this conference, is about remembering those women and men who were treated abysmally by the brothers. But let's not forget the role that ordinary people had in creating those brothers. So I hope that has been of some interest, and apologies for my technical glitches.
Mary, that was fascinating, and it really does make you think about things from the context of the 17th century, rather than just looking at the names of the accused, which that's what we're obsessed with. It's trying to find out the history of those accused. So that was really, really a powerful way of looking at the history and thinking about it. So thank you very much. Are there any questions in the chat? Yeah, let's have a look here. Just have a look. Oh, Juliana, go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's just what I'd asked on the chat. It's quite far back because I've been just commenting and stuff. But Mary, do you think that they were the ministers possibly brought in the brothers so that the finger wasn't actually pointed at them to put these kind of sentences people? You know, the minister was kind of the middleman, if you like, and not the actual one that says.
That's a really interesting idea, isn't it? And I think in some cases that might have been it, because if you're thinking, especially because if you think that if you're in quite a small community and you accuse Mary, and then you think, well, afterwards Mary's family are not going to be happy with me, or maybe it's not. Yeah, you're right. So maybe for some of them, it was a case of having clean hands, if you like. Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah. I just got to say, Mary, I actually feel quite emotional listening to you. You know, telling about how just as I said in the chat, that folk really didn't stand a chance. I thought that was a really, really powerful piece you've just done. Thank you. I'm actually sitting here, my eyes are filling up.
It wouldn't be a witches' conference if we didn't have a cry in the middle of it.
Oh, geez, oh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Mary is writing blogs for our new website. So please, if you enjoyed this talk today, and I'm sure everybody did, enjoy's not the right word, but if you were fascinated as I was by the talk today, then please have a look at the blogs as well. And you've got your book, The Border Witches, as well, which is, I think we've all got already. Just to give you another plug. So thank you very much indeed, Mary. That was great. Juliana's busy again now because we are about to move on to our next person, who is Dr. Michelle Brock, and she has sent through a recording for us today. So I'm going to come off here. Hello, folks. I'm assuming that Juliana's stopped the video to try again. Apologies, we're always going to have technical problems, but I do apologize. I'm just going to ask if Nancy would like to come on now rather than her slot later, if that would be possible. I'm going to ask to unmute and try and take off Nancy's.
Yes.
Are you there, Nancy?
I'm there. I'm here.
Can you start your video?
Yes. Can you allow me to share my screen?
Yes, it should be on already. That should be possible.
Should be on. Okay.
But we can't see you at the moment.
Can't see me. Well, I was having trouble seeing anybody on the screen except for this. I could see the speakers, but let me just get this started. Slideshow. Oh, here. Okay.
Excellent. We can see you. Right.
Now
Wonderful. So would you mind giving your talk now rather than later? I know you've been up for hours.
That's fine. That's fine. Yes. I've really been enjoying this conference. Thank you so much for inviting me, and have known Mary Craig and Julian in other contexts. So it was great to see them speaking.
Fantastic.
I'm going to talk. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my novel, my most recent novel, which was based on the story of Isabel Gowdy. This is a picture of Isabel Gowdy, an imagined rendering, of course, by Julia Jeffries, who focuses a lot on illustrations of accused witches and other people in history. And the way I got into this subject was through an ancestor search, and I am a Presbyterian minister. Whoops, that's and which I came to through a very roundabout kind of way. And I also had a background as I was totally in love with Starhawk. As some of you know, was a Wiccan who wrote about, still is writing, I guess, about earth-based spirituality and feminist spirituality. And so when I discovered the story of Isabel Gowdy through, I don't know why it keeps skipping. Anyway, through this ancestor search, where I discovered all these Covenanters in my history. I had a long line of Presbyterian ministers in my history, and a lot of them were Covenanters. And then I discovered that where they were the most populous were the most witch trials. And then I discovered that Isabel Gowdy was a very famous trial in a heavily Covenanter territory. So I started looking into her life story, because for me it was, well, there are two different parts of my own spiritual life that's of my own spiritual journey that's sort of colliding here in the 17th century. You know, highly feminist, social justice, and the Presbyterian. And I had studied in seminary and studied all the theologians, you know, in history, one of whom was John Knox. And I liked his theologies. I mean, I don't know if I liked them, but I mean, they were brilliant. But then here's something that John Knox wrote. Some of you know, I'm sure. The first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women. So he wrote this and published this in 1572. And he was against a woman being the queen. And so this was in my study. I see this as really beginning the misogynist part of the Reformation of the Reformed theology. And then another one is, I'm sure you know this too, is the this tract written by King James, Demonology, where he proved that women, or that witches were, I don't know, sorry about that. Anyway, he proved that witches were demons in human form, and therefore it was okay to torture and kill them. In fact, you had to get rid of them. This is a woodcut from the era. And then when I went on my research trip to Scotland, and before that I had studied and done lots of research, mainly through Emma Wilby's book, and I'm sure some of you know that, on Isabel Gowdy. I don't know if you can see me. I can't see myself, but can you see this?
Yes,
Anyway.
Nancy, we can see the book, but we couldn't see any slides you were talking about. So if you could just talk about the slides, that would be great, because we're having great trouble with the screen sharing. I do apologize.
Visually. Oh, that's too bad. Because I was showing you a picture of the tract, the cover of the tract that John Knox wrote, the misogynist tract against women rulers, and then the cover of the Demonology of King James. And now I'm going into my trip to Scotland, where I just found this incredible landscape. And Isabel's story happened in the Murray region, which was on the Firth of Murray, in Aldern and Nairn. And that area, like much of Scotland, is very open and wonderful skies, just looming clouds over rolling plains and moors and flatlands. And it just struck me that this is a landscape where myth and legend could easily grow up and flourish. And all these stories about the witches, the different kinds of spirituality. So can you still not see any of my slides?
No.
Have you hit the button that says share screen at the bottom of your screen? Because we're only seeing your video, which is the normal bit.
Yourself.
So you need to hit the share screen, and then you'll see a thing that comes on which asks which of the windows on your desktop is the one you want to share.
I hear you, but unfortunately I don't have.
It's only a big green button that says share screen.
Yeah, I know, and I've done that tons of times, but I don't see that on this particular screen. I'm trying to minimize the screen, but that's not working either. Sorry.
Because what we're getting is your webcam, the actual camera on your laptop or your desktop. It's not the screen that you're actually looking at.
What we'll do, Nancy, is if you can carry on with your talk, we'll share your slides afterwards. You can send them to us and we can share them on the YouTube for everybody to see. But if you can carry on with your talk without using the slides, that would be fantastic. I don't know if that's possible.
Okay. So this is really geared to my slideshow. It's unfortunate that you can't see it. Anyway, I was just talking about the landscape of Scotland, and then when I went to the Moray region, which is on the Firth of Moray, how open and flat and open, and you just feel like big skies everywhere. And it was very exciting just to be there in this place where Isabel had had her life and her trial. She lived in the Fairmtown farm town in Moray, which was a part of the estate of John Hay. And part of my ancestor search, my birth name is Hayes, which in Scotland was originally Hay. And I thought, oh my gosh, were my ancestors witch hunters? And I know Julian had mentioned, you know, that we could look at what the witch hunters were thinking and what was behind them. And so for me, I really wanted to look at both sides. I wanted to look at the witches, the so-called, I call Isabel a cunning woman, and the Covenanters who tortured her and tried her. And so I didn't want to just write a novel about good witches, bad Christians, which I think is pretty stereotypical. I wanted to look at both sides of both of those people. So what I found was that Isabel's confession was is known as being pretty unique in history, in that it was very elaborate and very embellished by all kinds of, where she didn't just say I had intercourse with the devil. She described the devil in detail, what he looked like and all the different things. And so as Emma Wilby said, she was probably a storyteller as well as, you know, a cunning woman in her community. And so they don't really know if she was tortured or not. Some of her confession sounds like she was tortured, where she talks about, you know, that she gives sort of the standard formula. I had sex with the devil, and I, you know, various things. But also a lot of it is, as I just said, is very elaborated, and not in any other of the confessions. So one of the things that I looked at was Isabel's, what was her belief, and what were the cunning women's belief? And the only evidence we have from her is her confession, because there wasn't anything else written about her at the time, although there's been a lot written since then. So Isabel actually believed that she was doing magic. I think it's pretty certain that she believed that. And the magic that she practiced was in that era thought of, well, it's pretty common. It was an animist kind of magic, where if you did one thing, you would affect something else. So everything was connected in the world. And it's funny that in some ways we're coming back to seeing that. But for her and for many in that time, it was, well, if I pound this rock with a club, I can raise the wind, or I can shape shift. I can turn myself into a hare or a crow, and fly around. And she also believed that she went into these trances. I interpret it as trance, where she would fly through the air with the fairies and the devil. And she would talk to the fairies if she would go to this particular hill called Downey Hill, which is actually still there. And so when I went to Scotland, and at the Downey Hill, she would see the fairies. The Queen of Fairy lived in the Downey Hill, and the elves were also in there. And they would the hill would open, and she would go in, and she could talk to them, and then she would go flying off with the fairies. And at one point the devil. She would be flying with the devil, and this was before her experience of her baptism, denouncing her Christian belief in Jesus, and accepting the devil, who would give her all kinds of power. So how much of this did she make up? How much of it was sort of standard witch confession? And how much of it was that she was a storyteller? How much of it was that she was really psychic and she really had these experiences? Or was she psychotic? And all of those theories have been posited about Isabel. So we don't really know. So the fact that there were these questions was kind of a bonus for me as a novelist, and I could put my own interpretation in there. Then the other side of the spirituality in that era was the Christian, of course, and there were many women who were very spiritual. And I wanted to look at this from a feminist point of view and see what the women's spirituality was. And the women, you can't see this, but I have an illustration of the ladies' calling, where a woman is sitting in sunlight and reaching up to God. And this was the ideal for women at that time, that they were, of course, they couldn't be ministers, but they could sort of be leaders in the fact that they could have this spiritual life and help other people. And what I discovered is that that kind of spirituality kind of morphed into feminism in the 18th century, where women who were very involved in the church started questioning this idea of male patriarchy, that men had to be in charge of everything. I thought that was interesting. So I see the spirituality of Isabel, this earth-based spirituality, which sort of evolved and became into our idea of Wiccans, and the mystics, the Protestant mystics, who evolved into the social justice area for women. So that's where my book, which I have a really nice map here. I'm sorry you can't see it, of all the different places where Isabel, the castles where she, in one of her trances, she said she flew with the fairies to Darnaway Castle, and Darnaway was the biggest and most important castle of the Earl of Murray. And then she danced and feasted in the castle, and had as much as she wanted to eat. Now, Isabel was a peasant and probably didn't have a lot to eat all the time. So this was a lovely experience for her to go in a trance and feast in the castle of the lairds. So I have lovely pictures of Inshock Castle here too, because what I did was I took Isabel and her story, and then took another woman who was also a real historical figure, Catherine Collis, who was a tutor to the daughters of the Laird at Inshock Castle, where this all took place. And I didn't know anything about these daughters of the Laird, although I had Catherine Collis's diary. And it was really hard to understand the theology of these Covenanters. And that was the hardest part of the research in this book, and their sort of self-abnegation, and their spiritual life was all about confession and repentance. And it was so strict. And of course, everybody had to go to church, everybody had to be Presbyterian. So anyway, this was, Catherine was on that side, and then Isabel was on the sort of other side of the peasants who were believing still in the earth-based traditions, the folk traditions, and she became a cunning woman, and of course didn't think of herself as a witch, but she began to be chased as a witch by the minister in this parish, and eventually put on trial. So the one other character in my book who is important is one of the daughters of the Laird, who I portrayed as being really interested in magic and really intrigued by Isabel, but also restricted by her her family and her church. And so trying to get through my slides here. I had a picture of the Great Hall of Darnaway, where I went to the Darnaway Castle when I was in Scotland, and it's a private home now, but it's still inhabited by the descendants of the Earl of Murray. And so the 21st Earl of Murray allowed me to go and see this great hall, which is built in 1450 and is still standing. So I stayed in there in Lochloy, very near to where Isabel's farm town was. And so I was able to walk around and even see the actual loch of Lochloy, and just imagine what was going on with Isabel and her belief in fairies. So just to end, I want to tell you about the Downey Hill. Downey Hill was in Isabel's confession. As I said, the place was, I think, a sacred spot for her. She would go there to meet with the fairies, and I wanted to find this place because on the R.A.W.S map it was still there, and but it was very hard to find, and it was interesting that nobody in the neighborhood knew about it. Nobody knew the Downey Hill. I finally found someone who knew the Downey Wood, and she was Downey was her name. She didn't know about the Downey Hill. So it was very hard to find it. And I kept driving around, and finally I found, just because the sun was shining in a certain way, I could see this mound through a forest of trees, just way across a farm field. And then I finally figured out how to get there. And I went with a woman I was staying with who has become a friend. And she was getting excited about this story too. So we foraged into the woods and up through the bracken and went up to the top of the Downey Hill. And we stood there and didn't see any fairies, but we had a moment of silence, which was extremely peaceful, and just felt, I just felt like, I understand why this was a sacred spot for Isabel. And then I looked down on the ground and I found a crow feather, which I took home, put on my wall. So that's it.
Okay, Nancy, thank you very much. That's really difficult when you haven't got your slides to talk to. I'm so sorry about that. We are being beset with some technical difficulties today. But if you could send us your slides, then we can send them on. I'll put them onto the YouTube video, and everybody will be able to see them. There's also in the chat, there's a really nice comment which says from Morag, it says, I've read your book, Nancy, and thought it was really excellent and nuanced portrait of the two women and their difference and connections. Also very beautifully written in relation to the landscape and the atmosphere of Scotland. And she also says, love you finding the feather. And Donald shares your webpage on there, so that's great. But if you could send through to Rose your files, we'll make sure that everybody can see them and see the lovely images that you were talking about. I'm looking forward to seeing the woodcuts especially. So
okay,
that would be great. Thank you very much for staying in there. We're going to actually try again because we've got 2 more videos, so fingers crossed.
Okay.
Pray to every deity you have.
Sarah, you can let me know if you can see it.
Right,
Just
okay.
shout yes or whatever.
I'm just going to turn you off, Nancy, for now, if that's okay. I'm just going to put you off.
Sorry, Nancy.
We go.
Right.
Thank you very much indeed. Right.
Right now, okay.
Hi, I am Nikki Brock, and I am an associate professor of history at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, where I study
Can
and
you see
teach
it?
about
Nope.
topics on the history of the supernatural and as well.
Right.
Shall I try?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Let's see if I can. Whiteboard. Nope.
It's saying that you're screen sharing.
Come on then, play. Can anybody see this?
It's loading up. It looks as if it's going to. Yes. Up. No volume. Really slow, love. You press a button. You press a video and I'll do the audio. You want me to try again, Sarah? Will I try again? I'll try it. See, let me know if you see it.
Oh, dear me. What a pity.
Let's see. Stop share. Right. I'll try screen share. Apologies, folks.
We're really looking forward to live people again.
Hi, I am Nikki Brock, and I am an associate professor of history at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, where I study and teach.
Can you hear it?
Yeah,
Can
can you hear it, Joanna?
Hear it?
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you
Can
see it?
anybody else see it? I can see it.
Yeah,
Does
I
anybody
can
else?
see
History
Yeah.
more broadly.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah, go
Yes.
for it.
Right.
I'm
Hey!
not able to make the Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland conference as I have another obligation. So the organizers have been kind enough to invite me to give a short recorded video.
It's going.
Juliana, it's gone again. We're having great technical difficulties and we do apologise. Let's see if this will work this time. Hello, everybody. Can I suggest that we come out of this now and that we can have a chat rather than trying to make these things work? We've got lots to talk about. Hi, Sheila, I can see you.
Sarah, if you just retransfer me the video, then I'll see if I can share it.
Well, we've got it transferred all over the place, so I think the easiest thing for us to do is to put it onto YouTube and people can watch it from there, and we'll share the link very quickly. Unfortunately, the next speaker as well was going to be live, but he sent us a recording. So I think what we should do now is actually bring the conference almost to an end and actually have a long plenary session, or as long as we need for as a plenary session. So if the committee would like to come on, that would be great. We've just got to work with what we've got, I'm afraid. It's a real shame. But we've got lots to talk about. We've got a heck of a lot to talk about. And it's not just going to be me, thank goodness. So, I can't hear you, Sheila.
Hear me now?
So, yeah.
All right, yeah. Do we still have Mary and Julian with us and Nancy with us in case people want to ask them questions?
Nancy's still showing up. Just having a look here. Julian's still showing, yeah. Laura's still here.
And Julian's still here.
Yeah.
Would you like to appear, please? That would be, if you're happy to, that would be fantastic. And then if somebody's got a question, maybe they could make themselves visible.
Sarah, can you make me visible, please?
I don't know how I'm stopping you being visible.
Sure.
It's gone. Okay, let's see now. Okay, so are there any overriding themes that are coming out of the conference today that people want to talk about? Any questions for particular speakers? Do our speakers think that we are doing the right kind of things? Any ideas on monuments and where we could put them, or what kind of a monument we should have? We're a very inclusive group. We just can't work the technology. We'd just love to hear from you.
Wouldn't worry too much about the technology. I've been at COP26 all week and it's been a nightmare.
That makes me feel better, Tom.
I'm so looking forward to be back in a venue.
Yeah.
I know it's been a bit of a nightmare. It's just technical difficulties here,
Sorry,
there, and everywhere.
ask a question then about the monument, the memorial. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
You said, you know, a location for the memorial. Has the society got any idea? I mean, would it be in Edinburgh? It seems to be the obvious place, or have you got any other, or somewhere else?
Well, it's quite hard to put something into Edinburgh because there isn't an awful lot of space. Plus, they're not very good at remembering women in Edinburgh.
No.
There are other monuments around. I mean, we are right at the beginning of this. I must say, we are really right at the beginning of this. So, it's not. We haven't identified a piece of land. We haven't identified a design. We're right at the beginning. So, all ideas are welcome. Doesn't mean that we're going to go with them. There's going to be a lot of consultation that needs to happen beforehand. But if people are thinking, well, that would be good, that would, you know, oh, I know there's a really visible space in this particular place where there were lots of witch trials or with particular historical significance, and we'd be interested in finding out about them. So, as I say, we're right at the beginning.
Yeah, and it's the same with funding. I think you said, you know, funding is also an issue because I'm involved with trying to get funding for a plaque for St Mary's Abbey in Haddington, and it's a nightmare trying to get through, dare I say, HES, you know. Anybody here from HES?
Well, Laura was here from HES. I'm not sure if she still is.
Yeah.
I have to say that when we've been in contact with Historical Environment Scotland, they've been brilliant. So far, because I mean, like Sarah said, we're all sort of very tentative steps into, you know, what we're doing and how we go about doing it. But the offers of support and guidance from Historic Environment Scotland and World Heritage have been extremely positive. So I can't say we've had any problems so far, but we've just started.
As long as we're not doing it on Zoom, that's me.
Yeah, that seems to be where we go horribly wrong.
Sarah, Laura's still here. I can see her on the captions at the top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Laura, do you want to say anything about that?
Sorry, Laura, for dragging you in.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think that there's certainly a lot of, just speaking with colleagues and things when I knew that I was speaking here, there's lots of support and things in the organization. I think it is just, it's such a big organization. There's lots of bureaucracy associated, you know, with what we have to, the standards and things that we have to keep to. So absolutely, I know that there's lots of, you know, support where we can, but obviously, yeah, I feel the pain that things can take much longer than you would like them to take.
Thanks,
I
Laura.
have a question for Mary Craig, if it's a good time.
Go for it.
Hi, my name is Leslie, and I was actually born in the area that Nancy was talking about. But now, unfortunately, I live in the United States. I'd much rather live in in the Elgin area where I'm from, you know, just for a variety of reasons. But I've been reading a lot about folklore, folk magic, and I was wondering if it was the case that communities like Mary, you evoked this climate of panic and this siege mentality in the era that you're talking about. And I was wondering if there were instances when communities pushed against that and tried to resolve their fear around witches without resorting to violence. And in particular, I've been reading about this ritual that I'm sure you all know about, but it was new to me, called the Force Fire, which was a ritual of extinguishing all the fires in a location and then actually generating a new fire and spreading it. And that was, I mean, from what I've read, and this could be wrong, that was considered a possible way to banish the demonic when people were suffering from plagues, you know, either people or the cattle or both. And actually read that this ritual was practiced in Scotland as late as 1833 in County Caithness, I think was the last documented instance. Anyway, reading about the witch trials and all the things that Mary was talking about and how painful it was and how violent it was, I was very moved to read about this ritual. But I was wondering if it was just something very occasional that didn't happen that much, or if it was actually a fact that sometimes communities did try to resolve their fear of witches without resorting to these things that we're talking about today.
Hey, Leslie, let's, Nancy's got a hand up first of all, and then Julian's got his hand up as well. So can't hear you, Nancy.
You want me to reply to that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yes, there probably were communities that resisted because they didn't just go out and find witches all the time. But the problem is partly that if a witch is found in your community and you go to the minister and there's an accusation and you go to the courts, we have a record of that. If you as a community resolve that yourself without going to the authorities, there isn't going to be a record. So it's really difficult to know about something that there is no textual record of. I think it's really interesting that the more you go into the Highlands and Islands, there are fewer trials and I think fewer accusations up there. So that's maybe something where the folk, maybe some of the archives up in the Gaeltacht, that we should be looking at what was going on in the areas where we don't have the trials and how did they, because again, we're still awash with the devil, you know, the devil's still charging about. So maybe that's where we need to be doing a lot more research, is to looking in the areas where there were no accusations and there don't appear to be any trials to find out. And it might well be that they were using rituals such as the force fire or other rituals or whatever. But I mean, I'm not aware of it myself, but I think it's simply because, as I say, if you don't go to the authorities, there isn't a text trail, there isn't a paper trail for you to follow. But maybe others know more about it than me.
Julian, have you got?
Yes, if I could come in here, thanks. That's an interesting question, and thanks, Mary, for your answer. And so, you know, the question is: do communities have informal ways of dealing with witches or protecting themselves against witches without resorting to witch trials? Yes, they do. Definitely, they do. And you know, I do not believe that the ordinary people in Scotland or anywhere else in Europe normally wanted witches executed. They normally negotiated with them. And it's true that if they simply negotiate, deal with it, and it comes to an end, as Mary says, there's nothing is written down, so we don't know. But there are times when we do know, because it comes in the neighbour's testimony when the witch is later brought to trial. And you realise that this person has been having formal negotiations with her or occasionally his neighbours for years. And you know, you see people you know, becoming ill because a witch has supposedly bewitched them, and what they will do is they go to the person, or they get some intermediary to go to the person on their behalf and saying, you know, can you comment? Can you wish me good health? And they have a drink together. You know, it's a complicated negotiation, but they settle their differences. That's what communities normally try to do, is they settle their differences among themselves. And you know, the ordinary peasants aren't thinking, ah, such a person is a witch, such a person must therefore be punished. They're thinking of sort of acts of witchcraft in the same way of acts of theft. You know, you stole something on one occasion, but you could say sorry. You know, you could be rehabilitated. And similarly, you know, you bewitched someone on one occasion, or you might have done, but you can be rehabilitated. And I see many of these reconciliation rituals. And so, yes, that is, I think, what normally happened. And in that sense, the entire witch hunt is an aberration. As Leslie asked, I'm not an expert on the ritual. I'm sorry, I didn't get the name force fire. I think it's sometimes
force fire.
Force fire. Need fire is what I've
Yes,
heard
it's
called.
the same as that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, I think that's the same thing. And that is a kind of, I'm not an expert on it, but it's a kind of insurance policy. It's not what you do if there is a witch in your neighborhood, or what to do if you think you're bewitched. It's, you know, you do it once a year because you never know what might happen. So it's another level of how you deal with witches, but it's another level also of why you're not thinking, ah, yes, of course, the witches must be burnt. That's not a normal community response at all. And that's another reason why I argue that it is, to a great extent, this is the local elites who are stirring this up. They are the ones who want the executions. But as I say, you know, they have their own reasons, and they are also sincere. And when they do, the ordinary people tend to go along with it. You know, you don't see mass protests against it, and that's something I'm occasionally asked. There are people occasionally who object to particular prosecutions, but the idea of witchcraft everyone accepts, and the idea that witches should be burnt, nobody, I think, says witches should never be burnt. And so it's a sort of, yeah, negotiation, sometimes puzzlement. You know, what is the government up to? That's strange. She was burnt. We never thought she was a witch. But sort of puzzlement doesn't lead up to resistance, I'm afraid.
Thank you,
so
Julian.
much.
Nancy, did you want to say something there? Can you speak now? No, sorry. Okay. Dawn has a question for Julian. Do you want to come on, Dawn?
Hi there. Hello. I was just wondering, I'm interested in witchcraft in terms of how it came about, the form of capitalism, coming from feudalism into capitalism. And I'm interested, as much as, you know, like following the history of the witches that were trialed and tortured and murdered. I think that I'm also really interested in finding the bits of our own cultural traditions and beliefs and that heritage that we have, the connection that we have to things that were actually exiled as part of the witchcraft trials, but more in terms of beliefs and heritage of our, you know, like those parts of it, not just the parts that are technically who was, you know, tortured and murdered and trialed, but more of like the parts of our community that was lost and within the structures of capitalism. I was wondering if there's anything logged about that side of things.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a question. It's more, but capitalism is where you seem to begin and end. So, yeah, sort of capitalism, modern economic system where people work for wages instead of being sort of self-employed, and the rich get rich through making profits rather than through collecting rents, which is what you get under feudalism. Yeah, some scholars have sort of mused in print about you know, what connections there might be between these things. And Scotland is one of the early places that that you can see capitalism beginning, but it's hard to see sort of direct connections between capitalism and witch hunting as such, you know, that, but you know, one sort of indirect possibility is that as local settlements get more integrated into a market economy, they're also more integrated into the authority of the state, whereas the sort of medieval village governs itself and is a sort of closed system, a closed community, and it's harder for the authorities to see what's going on within it. So once you get social differentiation, the elite among the peasantry may sort of side with the actual property owning elite rather than with the ordinary peasants. So I don't see capitalism as such causing witch hunts. You could even make a case for saying capitalism as such leads to the ending of witch hunts, but that depends on what your view of capitalism is, I suppose. But there are indirect connections between these various processes. I could probably go on longer about this, but I think you know, that may be enough for the time being, if that's any help.
Sorry, yeah, that's interesting. I mean more about like in terms of like say the sort of spiritual aspect we have to our society currently is more like Eastern practice, like yoga, that was brought over by Helena Blavatsky and you know, that it's come from other places, but our own link to spiritual practices, it feels like the spiritual Western spirituality was exiled with that. I was wondering if there's maybe any record of like belief systems like that or practices.
Oh gosh.
To see what was exiled within the community that way.
Yes, I think this is what's known among scholars as the disenchantment debate. Max Weber, pioneering sociologist around about 1900, argued that the modern world had become disenchanted. I forget what his original German phrase was, Entzauberung or something. And that more of the processes in the world were explained in material terms and less in spiritual terms. And yeah, it's a sort of debated idea. And Weber himself argued that this begins with the Protestant Reformation, and the Protestant Reformation makes religion a more abstract process and sort of reduces the church's claim to manipulate physical things, and Catholics then perhaps have to follow suit. Where we would be looking at this in relation to witch hunting is the role of the devil and the decline of the idea that the devil is a kind of person who is around among us. Okay, he's a spirit, but he can take physical form. He can move physical objects around. He can change things from one thing to another. You know, he can make things appear and disappear. He can get inside our heads and delude our perceptions and so on. And this idea that you use the devil and demons to explain things that happen is something that that one can see declining in the modern world. Personally, I would suggest that that we should be looking here at the 17th century scientific revolution, and so the key people are people like Galileo, Newton, and so on, Descartes, who are showing how more of the world can be explained in physical material terms without really a need to go, oh yes, that must have been caused by the devil, that must have been caused by a demon. So that's where I would look. And capitalism, is coming in at around that same time, and it may well be linked to it. But try disenchantment, try the scientific revolution. All right.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting you say that. It's like a Descartes, that was like everything was built up off the mechanistic worldview instead of more organismic one. But I'm interested if that would be part of the what was involved in the memorial as well. If it's more less like not just about the people to commemorate those, but parts of our own culture that have been outcast.
Yeah, it would be essential to understanding what's going on. You can put up a name, but what does it mean?
Yeah, thank you.
And I think that's why our project is not just simply let's get a memorial, because another statue, people will walk past it, pigeons will poop on it. What's the use of that? And that's why when we started off the idea of like we need a memorial, it then quickly grew as in we suddenly realized that this is extremely complex, and it's about a lived experience of 150 to 175 years of Scottish history, and therefore you have to contextualize it. So therefore it's not just about erecting a memorial, it's about bringing people a better understanding of that time in history, and not just these were accused witches, but they were people in their own right, living in communities, and how that community was affected by what happened in it is also very important about what we feel as a group. I think I'm right in saying, it's the whole thing is so important to get right. And that's why it's going to take a bit of time to do it all, because this will all take time. That's why we've come at it as a multi sort of pronged thing. It's not just about the physical monument, it's about different types of memorials. Like I said, other projects that we've highlighted at our previous conferences have been about remembering them in different ways that our society at this time and space is comfortable with, like the Sandpaper Project or the Silver Spoon Collective. It's complicated, and it's not just these are a list of people that had horrible things happen to them, and we should remember them. It's about finding out why we did what we did to make sure that we don't do it again. But it's repeated through history. I see Nancy put on the chat, the witch craze is very similar to the Holocaust, an era of fear run amok. So it's about understanding sociology of the time, what they feared, why they feared what they feared, and why we ended up in a situation like we did. So it's not just about right and wrong and black and white, because it's all just a big murky gray color. I don't know if that helps.
I have a question. Can anybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, you.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yay. Well, I just wanted to follow up on something Julian was saying about the era of Galileo coming, and what I discovered in my research, and I just want to check this with Julian, who's more of a historian, is that this was the age of reason was just beginning.
Enlightenment.
In the 17th century. And so even in theology, the church was trying to be so rational. And part of that was wanting to get rid of superstition and get rid of these, people who believed in the real devil coming into your life and all of that. And so they kind of wanted to throw the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion. They weren't able to see the goodness in the earth-based beliefs and practices. It all had to go. So I think that's something that also fueled the witch craze.
Okay. Now, Mino, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Though, as ever, as an engineer speaking to a historian, I've obviously got my heart in my mouth. in terms of the era that we've predominantly been talking about, it's obviously King James VI, and we have some understanding of the things that maybe drove him psychologically in this particular direction. But is this nexus of church and state something that was prevalent in other countries as well, or was that something that was more to do with his personal drive to actually put these things formally on the statute book, so it wasn't just religious law, it was affected the law of the state?
Shall I respond to that? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, fascinating question. And the question of the role of James VI often comes up. I don't think it's all about him. You know, the Scottish Witchcraft Statute was published in was passed in 1563 before he was born. It's true that he does, you know, give witch hunting a boost and credibility because of his role in the so-called North Berwick Panic of 1991, and because he published a book, though it's quite hard to find out if anybody ever read it. There's not very many references to it afterwards. It's not just about him. Probably most of the witches were executed, you know, statistically, you know, after 1625 when he dies. So, you know, he plays a role. But I tend to go back to the local elites. But church and state, you're absolutely right. They are important together. And, you know, in my writings, I tend to write about what I call the godly state. You know, even the secular authorities have to be godly. You know, even the king, even the Privy Council has to support the church and has to help the church punish sin. And, you know, something like witchcraft is a sin and it's a crime. And so, yeah, the two are working together. This isn't just a Scottish thing. This is a European thing. And, you know, in all the European countries, we can see you know, different versions of how these things occur. Sometimes you see more of a role for ministers in the church, like in Scotland. In England, the ministers in the church seem to have less of a role, and it's more the secular elites, justices of the peace, and so on. But you know, they're all trying to do God's work and to promote correct Christianity. So that is just a feature of the era in the whole of Europe.
Thank you.
Sheila, you've got something to say? You're mute.
No, I'm just fidgeting, sorry. No, I'm just fidgeting. You know me.
You were talking about Lisanne's books.
Yes, because I just suddenly thought that Don might be interested in one of them I've got here. I don't know if you can see that. Is Witchcraft and Folk Belief in the Age of the Enlightenment. I just started reading it. Scotland 1670 to 1740. But Lisanne's work on folklore is fascinating.
Thank you.
If that helps.
Yeah. Will you put a link to that in the chat? That'd be great.
Where's Laura? When you need her. Don't laugh at me, Juliana.
Sorry. I can't laugh at him to the theme.
Is it on our? I'm sure it's on our list on the website. Plug the website. It's brand new and fabulous. Yep. I'm pretty sure her books are on the list of resources on our website. But Lisanne Henderson, any of her stuff's really good. But I will try and see if I can find one for you.
Thank you.
Juliana?
I just wanted to bring up the point. I know that we've spoken about it as a group, but one of the most common questions we get asked about the memorial and everything is, why now? Well, we know that there are families still living, certainly in certain areas of Fife, where I know there's a couple of Lilius's generation, you know, they've carried on. And we know that there's a name, is a syndrome that it's like kind of, I can never remember the name of it. It's like trauma from years and years ago. So this is kind of why we're still campaigning for these people.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say
it's transgenerational trauma. I'm
there
sure
we go.
that's the right term for it.
Because I never have remembered that. But yeah, no, it was just to kind of make a wee point as to why we're doing what we're doing. You know, it might have been hundreds of years ago, but it's still very, very relevant to a lot of folk. all I wanted to say.
Okay.
I can jump in on that one, if that's okay too.
Yeah.
I think that the other thing too, like you were saying earlier, Juliana, I think, Juliana, it was you
Yeah.
about that you may have been accused of being a witch
Yeah.
at the time or something. I think that a lot of us can see the experiences of these women, particularly sort of in our own lived experiences as well. So I do think that there's, as I said, a commemoration is much more about the present often than it is about the past. So I think that, you know, as different people are able to tell their stories and make sure that it's not just sort of one narrative of history that we're seeing in commemoration, I think that that's also, this is sort of a symptom of that, and I think a great one as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of folk now, if say, thankfully things aren't, well, you wonder if it still is religiously, it's kind of, you know, fanatical, if you want a word for a better thing. How many of us nowadays would be getting accused of being a witch? You know, I think it's still very relevant. As I say, I would have definitely been.
I've put a link in the chat. Could somebody see if it works and let me know, because I'm incompetent when it comes to computers.
I can't see anything, love.
It's in the link's there. I can see the link. I haven't tried it though, because I don't want to come out of this.
No, you come out of that, we'll all disappear.
Can I just say
can we go to Mary next, please?
It was just to say, to pick up on what's just been spoken about. As I finished, I was talking about people that are still accused of being witches today. So I think it is really, really relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, the numbers of people who are killed as witches around the world isn't very high, because a lot of, well, the numbers are difficult because obviously a lot of people won't admit that they've killed somebody as a witch because they were a witch. But there are vast numbers of individuals around the world today who are physically and mentally abused because they are called witches. Very strongly, where there are strong evangelical churches. I'm not having to go at anybody's religious faith, whatever that's.
No, I was talking to Sheila, sorry.
But there are certainly huge numbers of people who are still affected by witchcraft accusations today, where there's a sort of twisting of traditional belief, and there is a twisting of superstition, and there's a twisting of natural healing practices. And then you get exactly as happened in the 17th century, harvest failure, somebody's child falls ill and somebody will be accused. And as I say, it's predominantly children at the moment in places like Nigeria and Senegal, but it is an ongoing, and unfortunately it is a growing issue. There are particular political economic reasons for that, but it's actually a growing issue. It's not a hangover from the 17th century that's still petering out. It's something that's actually growing. So it's something that, obviously we're in Scotland and we're talking about our historical dark past, and we're recognising that, you know, what we did, and we should commemorate it and memorialise it in some way, but it is an ongoing issue that I think we should all be aware of.
Can I ask, or can I ask what everybody thinks? Do you think there's a link between the fact that we've got the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, our resurgence in everybody's interest in this time in history is just all part of a social upheaval because we're changing with the climate stuff, and you know, and all these different things, that there is some kind of reforming of our societal norms. We've gone from maybe being a patriarchal society into more of maybe a matriarchal one. I don't know. I mean, people who.
Well, I have something to say about that. I can't see the. I can't see any of you now. I can only see myself. But I just was thinking that it's a feminist issue, and I think that it's very similar to, you know, the idea of the slavery, the Black people being persecuted for being Black, and then Jewish people being persecuted for being Jewish, and now we're coming into, you know, looking at women's issues. And I know that there were a lot of men who were also accused of witchcraft, but I see it as a feminist issue, and like those other issues, I don't see it as disappearing. I mean, I think there is still sexism, there is still racism there, you know, that keeps cropping up, anti-Semitism. So I think it's so important to have this witness for this Remembering the Witches of Scotland, because it stands up for against that kind of prejudice.
That's great, Nancy. Thank you very much. Sue, you've got your hand up. Sue Kay.
Oh, hi. The conversation moved on slightly, so I put my hand up, and just with regards to the idea of trauma that carries down through generations. And for a number of years, I was a school counsellor in Preston Pants, in an infant school in Preston Pants, which is one of the towns in East Lothian where there were a very large number of people accused. And one of the things I saw coming through with the young people in the schools was huge numbers of nightmares, of oh gosh, I'm sorry, I'm breaking up. Numbers of nightmares, and the young people relating back to themes that came up during the witch trials. There's a huge amount to be kind of said about all that, but for people who are interested in how those traumas sort of carried down through the generations, then definitely go on and research it.
Did everybody hear that okay? Because my sound was terrible.
No,
really sorry,
I
Helen.
Mine too. I couldn't hear that.
Could you type it in, or type a very brief summary into the chat, or? I'm really sorry about
I heard the mention of Preston Pans in there somewhere. Of course, that's where the only memorial to the accused witches that were pardoned. The only ones that were pardoned in Scotland is.
81 of them in Preston Pans.
I heard her saying.
Sorry, Mary wanted to say something.
Mary, go for it.
No.
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought she did. No, I just want to listen to Mary talking more because
I
it's
know,
interesting.
Mary, get us emotional again.
I think Dawn's maybe got her hand up.
Right, Dawn, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I just with what was it Sheila was saying there about the structural change. I've definitely felt that, but I feel like it feels more like it's coming from the breaking down of the structure built up off this mechanistic worldview, how it's set in the duality of like misogyny, like opposites feminism, and it feels like we need to move towards a more holistic view, which actually feels like it. To me, it feels like it needs to be more of a organismic worldview, where it's like we realize, bring back the soul parts of ourself and the earth and the things that that were lost at the start of these structures being built, along with that magical thinking and the witchcraft trials, but that seeing the real individual and holistic value in things that are less about what you do and less about time and that mechanistic structure of how things are built up off, but actually seeing the real sort of soul and spiritual parts within each other, and seeing that, coming away from the real opposition of duality and realizing that there's a bigger whole, that we're all part of a living organism that is the universe.
Yeah, that's
Juliana,
really interesting.
Juliana, next. Can't hear you.
Getting back to my bed. I know that's the way that we are going, but unfortunately, if we're looking at historical cases, there maybe would have been healers and stuff like that where that way wasn't allowed. Now, thankfully, we've got the freedom to do what we kind of want and where we want to go. But unfortunately, a lot of these people were probably pilloried for having that kind of, the kind of nature view and, making their herbs up and stuff, and it just took something to go wrong, and that's kind of where we've come back. But thankfully we're a lot more kind of free thinking now than they would have been allowed to be back then. That's what I think. He's agree or he's disagree, or
I think Leslie got a hand up there first. before
Thank
Sheila.
you. Now that we're in the feminism part of the conversation, I wanted to go back to something that Julian said, if I may, and I feel very uncomfortable calling you Julian. I hope you don't mind.
That's my name.
Okay. But it was when you said that the prosecutors, the persecutors, everybody involved was sincere. And I think I do really understand what you mean by that. But at the same time, there's a part of me that thinks that these people, these implementers, the people who made this happen, did they not have some interest in setting an example, like making an example of these women? And I mean, I look at my own Scottish family and how patriarchal my grandfather was. What happened to my grandmother when she had a stroke? What happened to my mother when she did things that my father didn't like? And this is in the 70s and the 80s. So what I'm going back to is this idea that they were sincere. And my question is, wasn't there an element of terrorism? And, in the sense that, as you pointed out at the very beginning, statistically, this happened in rather a lot of communities. Statistically, it happened to rather a lot of people, which means that many people were aware of this happening, even when most likely it didn't happen to them or anybody in their own family. They would have heard a story. They would have known of somebody. So to me, that's terrorism. And it's fear mongering. And so I wonder how maybe you don't accept that, but I'm just curious, if you do accept that a little bit, how does that coexist with the idea that people were sincere and they believed that they were doing the right thing?
Yeah, this is tricky. I mean, there's possibly two aspects to this. I mean, my initial response is, well, if this is like terrorism, terrorists are mostly sincere from what I can make out. They really believe in what they're doing. They don't have an ulterior motive. And one of the hurdles that we all have to get across when we try and understand this is the idea that the witch hunters had some kind of ulterior motive. We start with the idea they can't really have meant this, can they? It must have been about something else. Perhaps it's really about patriarchy, or really about capitalism, or really about grudges of some kind, but not really about witchcraft, because it can't be about that, because that doesn't exist. And so, the difficulty is we might not believe that it exists, or at least we might not believe that it existed in the way that 17th century people did, but they did believe it. And so, the ulterior motives, the wish to promote patriarchy, all comes through witchcraft. And if I can give you an example of the individual grudges as well. I mentioned the North Berwick witchcraft panic earlier, and the person who seems to have done more than anyone else to start that is the Deputy Bailey of Tranent, David Seaton, who does a bit of private enterprise torture of his own maidservant, Jules Duncan. And, in his own house, he tortures her to get her to confess to witchcraft. Well, don't knock it, it worked. Nobody said that was illegal. And one of the witches who he got Jules Duncan to name was Euphemia McCallion, rich Edinburgh gentlewoman who Seaton had a grudge against. But I don't think that he was thinking, aha, I don't believe that Euphemia McCallion is a witch, but I'm going to get her named as one so I can take her down because of my ulterior motive. I think he thought she is a bad person. And people that you don't like, you think are bad people. I think that still happens today, that when somebody doesn't like somebody else, they think they're a bad person. And when witchcraft is a thing that people really believe in, witchcraft is something that they think those people can really be. And this may come up, and Mary may want to come in on this too, because she's been talking about the Brodders or prickers, and we've got people like George Cathy. And he does seem to cross the line. you know, he encourages Janet Coates to name people who he may well think were innocent people, but you know, he gets money for doing it, and she gets to stay alive for another few months for doing it. But I'm still wondering about their intellectual processes as they do this. And, you know, at least part of them, they may be confused in their own minds, at least part of them may be thinking, well, you know, maybe they are witches after all. And, you know, I didn't particularly think those people were witches, but, you know, the court found them to be witches too. And so, you know, maybe that just proves that my powers are even stronger than I thought. So whether they are also thinking, aha, you know, I'm a fraud, I sent innocent people to the stake. Yeah, it's hard to get into the mindset of someone like that, but I think there probably are a few conscious frauds, but they are very much the minority, the exception. They're not what causes this to happen.
Yeah. I would also pick up on that. That's a really interesting point. And as you say, Julian, but to pick up on the point of terror is that if you genuinely believe that the devil is out to get you using witches, and that's fine, and you say, oh, well, they were terrorizing people. Actually, I think the two go hand in hand, because what is more terrifying than the devil? You know, you can't get anything worse than the devil. So you may actually be acting in an awful, sadistic, horrific way from our perspective. And the way you're treating accused men and women is awful. But the devil is 100 million times worse. So you're using terror in some ways, yes, but you're using terror because the ends justify the means, because it's the devil. You know, it's not as if it's just Billy down the road that you really don't like and you're having an argument with them. That's fine. You wouldn't use terror against that. But if you are literally fighting the Antichrist, then terror does become a weapon you can use. And yes, it will terrorize the neighborhood. Good. It terrorizes them, which puts them on the alert. So it's not just you acting in an individual case towards an accused man or woman. It's, yes, you are trying to spread fear of the devil because he is that terrifying. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And as you say, we all know, I mean, any lawyer worth their salt will tell you about court biases and all the rest of it. And it's the reason why in a court today, if you're up on a shoplifting charge, they're not allowed to tell the jury that you were shoplifting before. Well, in the 17th century, it was, no, we know about this person. We know this person's got a bad reputation going back 20 years. And so you're going to put all of those things together because you are literally fighting for your soul and fighting for the soul of your community.
Yeah.
And it's really sad that the Mickey Brock video didn't work today, because she's talking about the role of the devil in Scotland. So I would advise people to have a look at the link when we send it out. That goes into more detail about the devil in Scotland. And what a shame we couldn't have that as well. Sheila.
Yeah, sorry. It's interesting. We are not giving the people of the 16th, 17th and 18th century as much autonomy as what we think we have now. We haven't, as a species, evolved that much since then. You know, they were still sentient beings who had strong beliefs, and you can see it reflected in society throughout history. People who think that they are right will go to the ends of the earth to prove it, and to get their point across. I mean, you just have to look at the way we'll talk about fear and panic and how it makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I mean, there's examples of people behaving hysterically during the witch trials, but also look what happened to the Americans at 9/11. They managed to get the rest of the world to declare more or less war on a nation because of terrorism. So, I mean, you're just, it's the same argument we're having over and over again throughout history, but we're just using different villains of the piece. In the 17th and 16th century, it was the devil. Now it's ISIS. It used to be the Jews, and then it was somebody else, and then it was, you know, so it's horrible to think, but we are just spinning around in this never-ending circle and cycle where we have to find somebody to blame for all the things that go wrong. And I think that we should try and give the people of, you know, 400 years ago more credit. They weren't stupid. They were just functioning within the parameters of their lived experience and what they understood to be true.
And I think along with what Sheila's saying, that we have to remember that in every era, there also have been people who have stood up against this kind of prejudice and terrorism. And in the 17th century, as I understand it, Scotland was still pretty much mired in the witch craze, but England was coming out of it. And that by the 1700s, there were no longer so many trials in England, and they were sort of fading in Scotland too, because of the people who stood up and said, no, this is wrong.
Yeah, but you have to look at what Mary said earlier on about the witch prickers, that some of them, the effect of causing that much pain and suffering to somebody, one of them was considered to be a sadist, and but he wouldn't have been brought up on charges of sadism, but they were brought up on charges of not having the right forms. That's how much they believed in what they were doing. It wasn't that society didn't believe that this was a true and present and clear danger, because they did, and they thought that their reaction to it was proportionate to the event that was scaring them. But in Scotland, which I do find quite funny, is we do like to have the right forms for everything, and that seems to be, from what I've read, that goes back quite a long way. Yeah.
And that's why I take the view that, you know, apologies for things that happened so long ago don't actually make a great deal of sense, because they didn't think they were doing wrong. As sentient beings ourselves, we should recognize what went wrong and why, and break that never-ending cycle of always trying to find someone else to blame, whether it's the minorities in our society or threats from other parts of the world or whatever. So that's the true message. And in many ways, to my mind, that's the real message behind the memorial, because it takes it far enough back that no one today needs to take ownership for what happened. They can actually look at it objectively and say, yeah, I see what went wrong there, and what's my role in propagating that same kind of mindset today moving forward.
It's funny, I mean, in the 1980s, it's another example of this. I mean, I was quite into Saving the Whale and Greenpeace and all that, and was considered to be a bit of a quack because I believed in Amnesty International and all these things. And now today, that's becoming the norm. So what made me a quack then makes me normal now. So it's time, place, society.
Yeah, I just have a question about why 85% of the victims were women, if there wasn't some kind of bias operating in addition to the benevolent concern for people's souls and all of that.
Mary has a brilliant bit about that.
Do I?
Yes, you did. It was in your lecture for the library, the Scottish Library. You said something about that, which I thought was really good. It's to do with women can't physically fight, so they verbally fight, so it's scary.
There's a whole heap of stuff written about how we're weaker than men, therefore our faith will be weaker than men. We are physically leaky vessels, and so our faith will leak out of us, and all of these sorts of things. It goes back to John Knox and his trumpet against a monstrous regiment of women, and it was all of those beliefs. It wasn't that the church got up in the morning and thought, let's pick on women. It's that women were considered to be these inferior, weak vessels that would be easily slayed by the devil. We were more lustful than men. We had slippery tongues. We were gossips. Basically, we've just run down a list of everything that every boyfriend's ever yelled at you, and that was what was thought of us. And so if the devil's going to use us, if you think about it, if the devil's got a strong man who's strong in his faith and is physically strong and steadfast in the Lord, he's not going to be able to entice him. Whereas if you get a slippery, lustful, weak, pathetic woman, that's who you're going to be able to con as your handmaiden. And so that's why the church is looking and thinking, who is the devil most likely to be able to recruit? He's most likely to be able to recruit women. So that's why so many. And of course, there were just those general ideas of the fact that women were inferior and more likely to do things. And then, of course, when you get into the fact that if my daughter or my son becomes ill, I'm not going to ask the guy down at the end of the road to come and help. I'm going to ask the woman at the end of the road to come and help. So they are physically there when illness occurs. Things like your hen's not laying or your cow drying up and not giving milk, and that might have been because of bewitchment. These are household things. These are female matters. And so that's why you get the predominance of accusations, I think, against women rather than men. And it's more, you're more likely, men are out in the fields working, men are being merchants, men are in shops, men are farmers. Women are rubbing up against each other within the domestic sphere, and they're having to feed their families, which sounds really mundane, but I always use this phrase, it's where the mundane becomes murderous, because you know, you need your chickens to lay, so you've got something to sell in the market so you can feed your family, and it matters. Whereas your husband's out doing something exciting like buying and selling in the market. So it's more the domestic sphere where initial things happen. Why are my chickens not laying? All the women at the end of the road gave me a funny look. That must be why. So that's why you get greater, so more accusations are levelled by women against women, and because the church and society in general has all these thoughts about women being weak and lustful and easily swayed by the devil, you put the two together, that's why you get the majority of accusations.
But also, Mary, I think that it was women having power that was so threatening.
Oh yeah,
to the society. I mean, we're seen as weak, so women are not
fear.
supposed to be powerful. And all those people believed that you know, they had these powers to do all these things. And you had to squelch that.
Yeah, because you have things like, you have examples of, well, look, Mary Queen of Scots got power and look what she did with that. So there were, you know, there were examples. It's unnatural for a woman to have power. Yes, so that comes in. And especially if you are a woman who, as we've said, you know, everybody was a Christian, but you might have women who were able to do a bit of magic. They might be able to find your purse if it had gone missing or something like that. That was a power that men didn't have, so that was rubbing up against it as well. So all of these factors are tying in together to cause the level of accusations against women rather than men.
Brilliant. Can we go to Dawn's got a hand up first, and then Julian?
Great. Yeah, I think just in response to that question there about why it being women as well, I think that the start of the, you know, like as capitalism rose and the structures were put in place, that's where women were wrote out of how they were valued within those structures of society, because to earn money, you had to be a man. So where you had a value within maybe child rearing or even healthcare things, or whatever it was that you previously did as a job that was valued in your community. The structures that were put in place now, and you can see even in today's world, like, you know, education and healthcare, it's very mechanistic, and it's all, you have to have the right form, you have to have the right, but you know, it has to have gone through the capitalist structure of, this is how we value education. It's not it wasn't something that like having knowledge and wisdom wasn't valued anymore as it used to be. It's the same as how trees and the sun used to be worshipped. It wasn't valued the same because it wasn't something that we could capitalize off. So as those systems were put in place, that's also where the sort of feminine, as well as you know, those parts of community and what was valued was sort of written out, that it became, if you weren't adding to that, you were on the edges of the society. And I think it's, you know, people that weren't adding to their community, that weren't doing something, where you scapegoats to be, well, they're not a pillar of community, what are they providing for us? And yeah, anyway, sorry, that's capitalism.
Okay, can we go to Julian, and then can we kind of have an end to the participation part, if you don't mind, because the time is going along. It's been fascinating, I'm loving it, but we do have to call the meeting to an end fairly soon. So off to Julian, and then we'll have the R.A.W.S committee just updating on what we're doing next, if that's okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Yes, just a couple of things about the issue of women and why it is, 85% women. And you have to remember 85%, there's two important things about that. One, it's not 50%, so it's not gender blind. It is focused on women. But two, it's not 100%. And so there are some men who get involved. So one thing that is distinctive about Scotland is the interest in sex with the devil. And that's entirely heterosexual. And that I think is a sort of offshoot of the way in which the Scottish reformers and the Kirk Session are particularly interested in sort of stamping out extramarital sex. What the Kirk Sessions spend most of their time doing is punishing people for fornication and adultery. And the women are in the front line of that because, fornication and adultery get discovered when somebody gets pregnant, and that's usually a woman. And the men, they try to punish the men too. They try to be as gender blind as they can, but the fact is that the women are in the front line, and it's really only the women who are accused of having sex with the devil. So that's one of the ways in which the Scottish witch hunt is particularly interested in women. But the female majority you find as normal all over Europe. I want to pick up though on folk healers because they've come in on various occasions in this discussion, and it's important to get one or two things clear about the folk healers. Yes, there are folk healers. They are performing ritual, more or less magical cures. They don't use the word magic, of course, and doing various other services like finding lost and stolen goods, predicting the future, and so on. So yeah, you do get these in Scottish communities. About 2/3 of them are women, and about 1/3 are men. Most of them are kind of amateurs. They do it for the equivalent of a bottle of whiskey, as favors to help out their neighbors. Some of them are earning a bit of money by doing it, but the ones who are actually making a living out of it are mostly the male minority. So what you've got here is a sort of female dominated profession where the male minority rises to the top. Anybody heard of that? So there are male healers as well as female, and curiously, I think probably a higher proportion of the male witches were folk healers. Being a folk healer doesn't automatically get you accused of witchcraft, but if you're thought to have used your powers to harm someone, or if you're thought to have made a pact with the devil, you could get into trouble for that. So that's one of the reasons why we do find 15% men. So, but the other point that I would like to make about the folk healers is that you find them on both sides. Not only do you find them in both genders, but you find them on both sides. You find folk healers sometimes being accused of being witches, though most of the witches, as far as we can tell, aren't folk healers. But you also find folk healers involved in the prosecution. Once somebody goes to a folk healer and asks them to treat their illness, and perhaps if it doesn't respond to treatment straight away, oh dear, it's more serious than I thought. Perhaps you're bewitched. Is there anyone you suspect? And so the folk healers can be involved in actually diagnosing bewitchment, identifying witches, and actually acting as witch busters. That's a phrase that was coined by a folklorist. And actually trying to combat witches in their community, not by demanding prosecution. They're more or less conducting counter-magical rituals, but yeah, the folk healers are not all on one side when you look at processes of witch hunting in early modern Scotland, but they are there and should be remembered.
Thanks very much. So fascinating discussion. Sometimes think we should just have a discussion all day. That would be a great thing. But it's wonderful to have the speakers who are willing to give up their time and make videos and come to the conferences as well. And especially thanks to the speakers who have hung around after giving their talks to answer questions and be so generous with their time. We do appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. So what we'd like to do now is to talk about the group again, just little brief snippets of what's going on, what we'd like to do next. And so I'm going to shut up again because I'm the policeman here. I'll be telling them when to shut up again, so I'll shut up now. So Mino, would you like to talk about fundraising and finance as the treasurer, please?
Yeah, one of those big problems that Sheila mentioned earlier on was just the whole drama of trying to open a bank account. because none of the banks, would you believe, lockdown was so dramatic that none of the banks were opening business accounts or treasurer's accounts. So that took a long time, and there's a lot of paperwork. But now, thankfully, we're up and running. We actually have a charity-based account with the Bank of Scotland. And we also have our accounts on Amazon, so Amazon Smile. So you can find us on Amazon Smile, which means that whatever you buy on Amazon, we'll get a contribution coming in. And we also have the same charitable status set up with PayPal as well. So you can find us on PayPal. So anything that you transact through PayPal can also come through. So those are the main sort of recent developments. That's I think PayPal only came through this week, and Amazon only a couple of weeks ago, so that's bang up to date. Moving forward, we need to think more about our membership and how we actually manage that. So we've got an embryonic work group to set up to look at that. So there'll be more on that subject coming forward. And obviously, being a charity, we're able to gift aid whatever contributions are made, as you know, for whatever reasons, tickets, books, sales, membership, donations, etc., can all be gift aided, which means the government generously gives us 20% of that back as effective for everyone that fills in a declaration that they're paying at least basic rate of tax. So that's where we're going, taking it forward. So there'll be more on that. Now we've got the website up and running. It'll be much easier to get these things out.
Thanks very much. That's great. Sheila, do you want to talk about recruitment and subgroups and research and all that kind of stuff, please?
Oh, God.
Well, other people can help you as well.
All I can say is, like I said earlier on, myself, Donald and Liz were doing some of the trustee stuff. And just to sort of reassure me, there was a discussion at one point in one of the seminars I was at where they were all, everybody was complaining about bank accounts. And some of them have taken even longer than us to get it all sorted. So I don't think it's unique to us, but it did feel like a bit for a while that they were just picking on us. But
we shouldn't complain. We did get some compensation.
Well, that is, yes, that caused a lot of stats, caused a stir as well when I told them. So yeah. So right, so we've got our oh, my brain's just melted. Right, we have our Facebook group, and that's extremely active, and a lot of stuff happens on that. But now we have our website as well, and I absolutely urge everybody to go and have a look. Laura did an amazing job putting it all together, and as like we said earlier on, Mary has written some pieces for it and is going to write some further pieces for it. So we're all really excited about that. You can always get involved by contacting us on our our emails, which is on the website, info@R.A.W.S, if I remember correctly. But yes, we are a very small group. I think you've kind of met everybody today. There's been a couple who aren't here today because of other commitments. But you know, we're always interested in bringing in new people who've got new skills. We're looking at people who've got skills that technology would be really helpful. How to make computers work. No, the thing that I think we want to move forward on from this conference and from launching the website and the charitable status is that obviously we need to raise money to pay for all these things that we're hoping to do. So if anybody can think of any ways that we can raise funds or would like to donate, please visit the website. The group itself, obviously, we have the ongoing stuff where we're in talks with the Scottish Parliament and the church about, you know, their role in it and what can be done to, you know, sort of recognise what has happened. When we want to spread this discussion to as many places as possible. We're looking at obviously expanding on research now. Now that we've got all this sort of technical, boring stuff done, and we're looking at getting into more of the research. And one of the ways that we're looking at spreading the word is street naming. One of our supporters, Heather Upfield, had managed to get Bessie Graham a street named after her in Kilwinning, which then helped us when one of our Facebook followers suggested we do the same in St Monans, which obviously we worked with them to do. And it's about linking in with heritage networks to find out as much information around this time in Scottish history as possible. As both Gillian and Mary have stated, there's lots of things that are adjacent to this that are just as interesting. It's not just about the accused witches, it's about their community, about the people who persecuted them and prosecuted them, the brothers, like all the stuff that's been talked about today. And now I feel as if I'm just waffling a load of rubbish. So I don't know if somebody else would like to take over, because I think I'm just not.
Well, it was one of the things that come from the training that we've been looking at was help with archival material. Julian's obviously a historian and we're not. So what we're finding is the archive people do run courses to access archive. One of the other things I'll be looking at this week was a course to be able to decipher writing in older documents. Yeah, well, the handwriting, yeah, and things like that. So to say you're going to do research becomes a nightmare, because you find the document, then you can't read it. Things like that. So we're looking at that as well. The other thing that we've got to watch what we're doing is we are a charity. So you have to have your gender balances in place before we can do anything. And I like to think that we've stuck to that all the way through, right for the Constitution was written. And I'm not saying it should be easy, but it's something that has to happen. So that's another thing we have to look at, and it all takes time, because when you go into the regulatory body, which is OSCA, that you go to their website, you could spend a whole week reading all the stuff you have to do and you can't do, and it's a nightmare. And I think that's what's come across with a couple of short bits of training I've done this week. So it's all well saying we're going to take things forward, but we have to be careful now that we're a charity how we take these things forward. But I'm sure we'll manage.
It's about taking things forward in a way that people will trust us. That's one of the reasons why we thought become a charity, because we're regulated then, and then people know that we mean business and that we're not just some sort of I don't know, fly-by-night organization. I don't know what other way to put it. That we are very sincere about what we're trying to do, and that we want to do it properly, and we want it to be an established thing that's there forever.
But also, we are just a small group, and we can't do the research for the whole of Scotland. So what we're hoping to do is to set up some subgroups, be an umbrella group for research. So, for example, Juliana's started working with the Inverclyde
Heritage Network
to do research and in the network to actually find out information as well. So we have links through the Facebook all over Scotland, but we don't have access to the research necessarily unless somebody decides to give it to us. So we're begging, give us the research, and then we can put it in the website and people can see it and can find it, and just it makes it a lot more transparent and helps to add to the story. So if you have research, you will be very grateful recipients. Julian.
I was just going to say the same, Sarah, that some of the stories that I'm hearing about is like local folklore. So you've got to kind of pick out, and you've got to look into what's factual and what's just, like a local rumour or something like that. But hopefully by reaching out to the, to the public, to everybody regarding the research, it's maybe something that they've heard about that we don't know about. Maybe something that's a bit more well known in their area. So, and this is how we find out about, you know, possibly anybody else who might have been accused, or, you know, just even finding out your own local history is absolutely fascinating. And I have totally had my eyes opened about Inverclyde, because Inverkip, which is the next village to me, was actually the second highest number. It was the worst and second highest in Scotland for accusations per population. The first one was Haddington, the second one was Inverkip, and it was 35 people out of a population of 200 who were accused. So that's almost a quarter of the village. So, you know, I didn't know about this until I started looking into it. So you just never know what you're going to find out, or if anybody knows anything, approaches, don't be scared to say.
Sheila?
Yeah, I mean, Juliana's right. And what's also interesting is the folklore that around it. Like we were talking about earlier on about the stories of, you know, like witches' ponds and all the rest of it, is the fiction around all this is just as fascinating as the fact. And I'm picking both, because a lot of the folklore, you know, has some kind of basis in fact, but it's just taking it back and finding out about it, which is interesting. But yeah, I mean, Juliana is working in Inverkip on a sort of pilot sort of thing that we would hope to replicate, and and as part of that as well, we are doing educational resource packs that Margaret's working on, but I don't know where Margaret's gone.
She's there. She's
Margaret,
there.
I can't see you.
Oh, she's over there.
She's there, so Margaret talk to that, which I think is really important, because we complain about the fact that Scottish history is not taught in Scottish schools. So let's fix it. So Margaret is the person to be doing that with her magic wand.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's one of the really positive things that we can say. A lot of people mentioned at the beginning that, you know, they hadn't been taught Scottish history in schools, and it's great to see that that's changing. And we've had a lot of interest from people who are working in schools and colleges, particularly teachers, who are working with pupils and that are trying to raise awareness of this issue. And some of them have been in contact with us through the Facebook page. And we're trying to work with them to develop resources that we can share so that they can be used with teachers to provide the reading materials and all the resources that are up on our website, but also some activities and materials that can be used with pupils. And I think that for us, that needs to connect very closely with the action that's happening on the ground and in local areas and the work that people are doing. So we feel it's something that, you know, we can work together around. So as I mentioned at the beginning, really encourage anybody that's doing some work in their local areas to get in touch with us, share any resources that they're using, teachers that might be using resources in schools, and we can try to create a sort of a data bank of that so that we can share that more broadly.
Juliana?
Just to follow on from what Margaret's saying there, it's been quite surprising how many teachers have approached us to find out about education packs, because the subject is a lot more approachable, it's a lot more accepted, because people do want to find out what happened and they want to know the truth. And obviously this is where we've got to decipher what's fact and what's fiction. You know, we're maybe not going to know everything, but we can certainly do our best to try and find out and take it out to the wider audience. And what better to start with the younger generations, you know, who have got a more open mind, I would say. And they are fascinated about what they can find out. So yeah, there's a real interest for it. So I think Margaret's doing a fantastic job.
Liz, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Julian's actually put a note in to say that Scotland's People, or the National Records in Scotland in Edinburgh, they've actually got the website. The church records, or the Kirk records, are
records, but they're incredibly difficult to search.
They are.
So you've got an index in your
not
local library, which some libraries do have. So go and ask them if they've got anybody who's already done an index to it, because otherwise it's so difficult to find.
Yeah. I mean, they are fascinating, even just to literally sit and read through. There is also another link on Find My Past. They've just recently added on roughly about 110 names of accused witches, mostly in the, I'm sure it's 1658, if my memory serves me right. And they've got different areas. We've got Stirling, some in the borders, sort of some Dumfries and Galloway area. So again, you can go into there. On our website, we also have some links to basically starting to do your own family history. It's something that I do myself. I do my own, and I'm a member of Fife Family History Society. So we've got some links there to start you to get into the nitty-gritty if you want to do your own, or if you want to go sort of further back. Find My Past, you can go on there, even if you just took out a temporary membership. Scotland's people, when you go in, you just pay as you go. It's like you buy some credits and you use up your credits, but time consuming, I'll not deny it. Quite difficult, as Sarah says, because some of the writing, you look at it and you think it looks like chicken scratches, and some of the wording, but if you've got a mindset to do it, it's totally fascinating and well worth it if you can do it.
Okay, Donald, are you good at last word?
The last word is I've enrolled in one of the courses to decipher these things. So before the end of the month. So I'll need a new pair of glasses before then, I think.
Julian, last word.
Yes, hello. Just to say that, you know, looking at the church records or Kirk records, I mean, church, Kirk, same word, isn't a matter of just sort of randomly looking for a needle in a haystack. The Survey of Scottish Witchcraft has got references to where you can find the records of particular people. So, I mean, I just now looked for an example. So a witch I happen to know that has some church records, Isabel Watson from 1590 in Presbytery of Stirling. So if you go into Isabel Watson 1590, it will say Stirling Presbytery Records CH2/722/2. So you can't instantly go in Scotland's people to CH2/722/2, but you can get there in a fairly short amount of time, and it's better than just turning pages randomly on a digital screen. And so you do have some guidance in the Witchcraft Survey already as to where to find the documents.
Excellent. That's obviously something I've missed before. Mary, last words. Can't hear you. Can't you?
Quick last word. As I work as a community historian archivist, my advice is when the joy that is COVID goes away, for any researches you're doing, go and make friends with your local librarian and your local archivist, because they are the ones who will tell you where things are hidden, that you will be, they know where the gems are hidden. So make friends with your local librarian and your local archivist.
We have our very own in Sarah.
Thank you.
Right,
I'm actually going to call this to a close and say thank you very much to everybody who's stuck with us through all the thick and thin, the ups and downs, the technical delays, but the talk has been fascinating, and the recordings will be available on YouTube. I won't promise by when, but they will be available in the near future, and we'll be in touch with everybody with links to the talks that you didn't see by Eventbrite as well. If you want to get involved, please do get in touch with us. There's always something that people can do, join in with working together. There's always something to do. So please do get in touch with us. And until next year, and it won't be on this week next year, because I've been told 3 times now, don't have it this weekend, because it's the same as another meeting. So it will be sometime next week. And maybe we can start a book group.
Yes.
Fiction. Witches and fiction, or witches.
Oh yeah, well, I have an interest in that.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of interest in that, and I think there's a lot of authors on here who would be interested in sharing what they've done and how they transferred the factual things into the fictionalized stories. So more to come, loads more to come. But for now, we'll say goodbye and thank you very much for coming. That was brilliant. Thanks.
Take care. Please.